Yeah, if somebody wants to come in, they'll have to open the door again. Okay. Oh, you went far to get a coffee.
What?
Thought you getting a coffee here in the building, but I guess not.
They want to real.
All right, should we get started?
Yes,
Okay, well, first of all, I think something should be said for the fact that we're now in the 6-day period of the 6-day war. I know that obviously for a lot of us, it's Yom Yerushalayim, the 28th of Iyar, is a very important Chag. It's a day that Hashem brought us back to Jerusalem. It's a day that we not only came back to Jerusalem, but by coming back to Jerusalem, we enabled the Shekhinah to return to Yerushalayim Shalmala, which has, tremendous impact, spiritual impact on all of creation, and certainly on our people, and had a ripple effect for Jews even in the diaspora. So that's something, we should, of course, keep in mind. But there's also some people, and I've become more and more sympathetic to this perspective in recent years, to celebrate all 6 days, to treat all 6 days as a quasi-holiday. Like I kind of avoided Tachnun this morning and also yesterday at Mincha, because I think there's a Kedusha to all 6 days, especially the first day. The first day is when Kafvav, yesterday, is when all the major Nisim took place, all the major miracles took place that allowed for the victories, meaning it's when we took out the enemy air force against, it was uncanny, the quote-unquote series of coincidences that had to take place in order for Israel to be able to take out the air forces, or the majority of the air forces of Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Jordan. I think Lebanon were just downed one plane and they just backed out of the war. But the fact that we had to, with these old, they had all these Soviet, sophisticated planes and anti-aircraft, but we had these old French jets and not so many, a little over 200, I think, and we went and we did what we did. And the fact that we were able to succeed in that mission against all odds and take command of the skies is a lot of what helped us to win the war so quickly. So, we say it's a 6-day war, but when you take into consideration what happened on the first day, we could say that it was a 6-hour war, that in 6 hours we took control of the skies, and that really allowed for the victory that took place. Also, on the first day of the 6-day war yesterday, it's the day that we conquered Gaza, right? That's important. Gaza could not be conquered with planes, because just like we realize in this current war in Gaza, that if we're going to try and win a war in Gaza with planes, because of how densely populated it is, we'd kill a lot of civilians. And that's something that, if we want to be cynical, we could say Israel wants to avoid because of how it looks on TV or how it plays in the news cycle. But, some people could also argue that we genuinely don't want to kill innocent people. And therefore, we know that when fighting in Gaza, it's for the most part, our only option is a ground operation. So just like now, also then, during the 6-day war, we had to conquer Gaza in a ground operation that was ultimately successful, but cost us a lot of our boys. Today, the second day of the war, is when we really celebrate the conquest of the Shomron and northern Yehuda. Right, so that's today, Kaf Zayin. Tomorrow, Koach Iyar, in addition to being the day that Rav Kook made Aliyah and the Yahrzeit of Shmuel Nevi, it's also I think it might also be the anniversary of the war between Yoshua and Amalek, by the way, which is interesting, the 28th of Iyar, but if I'm not mistaken. But it's also the day we liberated Jerusalem. And everything that means in terms of Jewish history, in terms of our identity, in terms of how we understand this entire process, right? Keep in mind that, like Hanukkah, Hanukkah was a very controversial war at the time. The Maccabees led Seleucid Greek guerrilla struggle that was not supported by the majority of Judean society, not necessarily supported by the majority of Rabbanim in the beginning. And certainly there was a lot of Judean society that had bought into Hellenism and had bought into the Greeks being the center of the civilized world and where humanity is headed, and therefore we wanted to attach ourselves, or many of us wanted to attach ourselves to that. Um, not just not just the obvious Hellenists and Hellenizers among us, but even I think the majority of the population was kind of like passively accepting of Hellenization if it was good for us. In ways, by the way, that maybe mirror our own time. You know, you have a lot of Israeli society who might not be actively trying to westernize Israeli society and might not have sharp positions on the issue of westernization or the cultural conflicts in our society, but passively accept it as, you know, Western civilization is a positive thing and we want to kind of be with them, or maybe we're kind of with them and maybe it's good to be with them, you know, like not people who necessarily have strong, principled, formulated positions, but simply that they just take for granted that this is probably a good thing, and it's, you know, if there's no compelling reason why not, then we might as well kind of go with the flow. We might as well attach ourselves to Western civilization and see what we can get from that, you know. So I think that's a lot of how Judean society looked at Hellenism and the Seleucid Greek Empire back then. And the Maccabean fought this war anyway, and they decided to, take the initiative and launch a guerrilla war. And they had many victories that were not necessarily seen to be correct, even though they were winning, which is obviously helpful. When you're winning, then you gain in popularity generally. More people are willing to support you because you seem to be successful. But it was really it's not for nothing that Hanukkah is really the only Maccabean festival we really have today. That's not by accident. And I think part of it is because of its supernatural nature, right? What Hanukkah actually celebrates is not even the Battle of Beit Sur, meaning, there's obviously debate about what Hanukkah celebrates, but practically speaking, yes, it celebrates the entire war. Yes, it celebrates the Battle of Beit Sur, where we come back to Jerusalem and we rededicate the temple. But the actual act that, even the Haredim will say, like, we celebrate on Hanukkah, is this one-day supply of oil lasting 8 days. And the reason why that's important is because it really gave a stamp of divine approval to the entire revolt. When the nation saw that there was this obvious open miracle that took place for the Maccabim in the temple with the miracle of the oil lasting 8 days, that basically framed the entire war as miraculous. It framed the entire war and all the deeds of the Maccabim until then as having divine sanction. So it was a way for Hashem to kind of give a stamp of approval to the entire revolt. And I think that we could look at Yom Yerushalayim the same way. That Yom Ha'atzmaut wasn't something that the entire Jewish world necessarily got so excited about. Certainly not the entire Torah world, right? There are people, a lot of Haredim, who had like a wait and see attitude, or even a hostile attitude, like an antagonistic attitude, like this is not what we want, this is not Geulah, this is not right. This is just, in some quote unquote secular nation state, right? But the 6 Day War, because of the openly miraculous nature of the 6 Day War, suddenly we now have a divine stamp of approval on the entire Zionist enterprise. The fact that we experienced these open miracles, and really, against all odds, we were able to liberate the portions of our homeland that were so central to our yearnings for thousands of years, so deeply connected to our history, to where our ancestors are buried, to where so much of our national story played out and developed, the places we can call the cradle of Jewish civilization. Like, we were able to return to these places against all odds in a 6 Day war, very dramatically. And as a result of that, As a result of that, I think that showed that the entire process had a miraculous nature. It was a lot easier to make the argument, right? It's a lot easier to make the argument that this is from Hashem, this is miraculous. All the things that Harav Kook had been saying, even before the state was established, suddenly began to make sense to people who it didn't make sense to before necessarily. So I think that this is something we need to take into consideration, and as part of our celebrating, whether somebody wants to celebrate one day Yom Yerushalayim or celebrate 6 days. I think it's worthwhile to celebrate 6 days, but obviously not with Hallel. Hallel is just Yom Yerushalayim. Um, the fourth day, by the way, is Hebron and southern Judea. And then the fifth day is the Sinai, which unfortunately they don't have anymore. And the sixth day is the Golan Heights, which is also an interesting story because the Americans at that point had really tried to stop the war and tried to stop us from taking more territory. I mean, once by the sixth day, it was just, from the American perspective, this was like a disaster.
Why?
Because Israel was not supposed to win. And Israel was not even supposed to fight the way it did. And in the process, I don't know if a lot of people are aware of this, but we had to destroy an American ship, the USS Liberty. And that's something that's still it's still not 100% clear what happened, like what exactly they were doing. First of all, what was the Liberty doing? Were they spying on us? Were they giving over our positions to the Egyptians? Did we intentionally destroy the Liberty? Did we unintentionally destroy the Liberty? Was it a mistake? And there are obviously a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding this. It's very hard to get to what actually happened, like what's the real story behind the destruction of the USS Liberty. What we know is that Israel destroyed it. It was an American ship. Israel destroyed it. Question is why? Question is, was it intentional? And I'm not sure if we'll be able to really definitively answer those questions, just due to the fact that there might be so many parties who are looking to cover up the truth, and there's so many conspiracy theories competing for to answer the question. So it becomes hard at that point when you have a situation where an event is so mystified and there's so many kind of like amateurish attempts to demystify it, but according to their own like narrow ideological paradigms, it becomes hard to understand. And maybe the best we can do is do the same, maybe with our own, narrow ideological paradigms, or maybe less narrow, ideally less narrow ideological paradigms. We can present conclusions as well that make sense according to our broader understanding of the U.S.-Israel relationship and what was going on at that time. My assumption, right? Again, I don't know. I can't prove it. My assumption is that the Americans were spying on us. They were disturbed by the fact that we were winning as dramatically as we were. They had warned us not to launch a preemptive strike. We did it anyway. In Yom Kippur, the Yom Kippur War, the Americans were much more successful at preventing us from launching a preemptive strike. 6-Day War, not so much. And they were trying to obstruct our success. And I guess, I don't know if this is something that would have come from the Prime Minister's office or somebody in the field, but somebody on the Israeli side definitely, got the idea to attack the ship and destroy it. And I imagine it was something that at the time Israel saw, or certain people within the Israeli defense establishment saw as necessary for our war effort in that moment. And that's what I assume, that they were doing something bad. We stopped them by sinking the ship, and no one wants anyone to know what they were doing, and therefore we're all quiet about it. That's what I think.
America want us to win and get more land?
In general?
Yeah.
From there, I mean, that's what layer would you want that question answered on? Meaning, you want that spiritual answer to that? Do you want
Politically, I think.
that you want to? I think the United States.
Whatever you like.
No, I mean, I think if we're trying to understand it through.
But more political.
Well, no. First of all, if you want to understand it through the worldview of our sages,
yeah,
right? If you want to understand it through the ideological lens of the Jewish people, which we can call emunah.
Yeah.
Okay, emunah is the, just like you say, liberalism is the ideology of capitalism. Christianity was the ideology of feudalism. You could say there are certain Islamic ideologies that might be the lens through which the Shiites or some of the Sunnis look at the world. We have a lens called emunah. According to the Gaon of Vilna, if you want to know the ideology of Israel, the worldview of Israel, you learn Sefer HaKuzari. Like Sefer HaKuzari by Rav Yehuda Levi is, according to the Gaon of Vilna, the worldview of Israel. Right? This is emunah. What we learn, according to our historiography, is there are 4 empires who are all derivatives of the Egyptian empire, right? Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Edom, who all try to usurp our mission, take our place in history, and prevent us, not usurp our role in history and prevent us from fulfilling our mission. Okay? And they all have different ways of trying to do it. Babylon tried to take us out of the land. Persia tried to kill us. The Greeks allowed us to be in our land, but tried to take away our Torah. And Edom tries all 3 in more concentrated form. Edom kind of enters history as the Roman Empire, but evolves, becomes Christianity, becomes Western civilization, and is now led by the United States. Okay? When Israel comes back to life, on a deep, intuitive level, Western civilization's collective soul senses it's in danger. Senses that it's being replaced, that Israel is coming back to life to replace the 4th Empire, right? According to, remember, it's very interesting that Edom, Esav, is the 4th Empire, because according to the Nevuah of our matriarch Rivka Imenu, Edom and Israel, or Esav and Yaakov, represent 2 different civilizations in her womb, right? When we were twins in her womb. And she understands from this prophecy that when one is strong, the other is weak. When one is dominant, the other is submissive. It can't be that Esav and Yaakov are simultaneously dominant on the world stage. And for the last 2,000 years, Esav has been dominant on the world stage. Western civilization has been dominant on the world stage. And now that Israel's come back to life, I think on a very deep subconscious level, this is frightening to Edom. Now, that's subconscious. That's not conscious. But I think that when a person, we also learn that when a person assumes high office, when a person becomes a leader of a nation, they lose their free will. They also apparently have their transgressions wiped out, same as when a person gets married or when a Gentile becomes a Jew, right? They become a new person, so their previous transgressions are eliminated, are erased. So same when somebody assumes higher office, when somebody becomes a leader of a nation, they become a new person. And that new person doesn't have a lot of free will. They have to act according to the collective subconscious of their national group, or according, let's say, to the will of their national angel, their national spiritual minister, their sar. Right? We learned that all of their, for example, the Ramban teaches in Parshat Achrei Mot that when Israel is in a specific land doing mitzvot, we're strengthening the spiritual minister of that nation, which in turn strengthens that nation economically and militarily and diplomatically in the world. And that's how the Ramban explains why Jews living outside our land is like worshiping idols, because the mitzvot we do strengthens, gives spiritual power and then material power in turn, right? Because what we do impacts the higher worlds, and that comes back and impacts this world. So because we are strengthening these spiritual forces unintentionally, right? We're just, let's say, lighting Shabbat candles or wrapping tefillin or making brachot or giving tzedakah in Poland, right? Let's say, I don't know if Poland's not necessarily a primordial nation defined by the Torah, It's maybe more a socially constructed nation. That's a larger conversation. Whether the Ramban is talking about, whenever there's a socially constructed nation, do they receive a spiritual minister, right? Or does the spiritual ministers only go according to the primordialist nations that are introduced in Parshat Noach, right, from Ham and Shem and Yefet, right? But it could also be that as humanity changes, right? Because a lot of the nations mentioned at the end of Parshat Noach don't really exist anymore in an identifiable way, right? So there's been a lot of changes. So it could be that a lot of the socially constructed nations of our time that have real identities, right? There is a Polish identity today. There's a Ukrainian identity today. There's an Italian identity today. There's a Japanese. Maybe Japan goes back further, but so it could be that maybe those spiritual forces realign, and what was, let's say, the what was maybe known as the spiritual minister of primordialist nation X is now the spiritual minister of socially constructed nation Y, right? It could go that way. I don't know. I'm not an expert in this, but we know that the Ramban is saying that the reason why nations historically have been relatively strong when they have large Jewish populations in them and begin their historical decline when they mistreat those Jews and those Jews leave and go somewhere else is because of the impact that Jews doing mitzvot in those lands have on the spiritual minister and in turn on the nation itself. Okay, so if we're already coming from the perspective that all of these nations have spiritual backends, like a website with code, like the code of the nation, so to speak, right? Like the front end is the nation, the back end is the code. Same with Jerusalem, by the way, right? Jerusalem, Shalmata is the front end, what we experience, this kind of ancient mountain city. And then you have Yusham Shalmala, which is like the code behind it, which, according to Rashi, actually met Yaakov Avinu on my mountain when he had the dream with the angels going up and down the ladder, and then in the morning he renamed Luz Beitel.
In this example, what would be the full stack?
What?
In this example, what would be the full stack? You say the front end and the back end, but what about the full stack?
I don't know what that means. I'm not a computer programmer. I can only give the metaphor to the extent of my own knowledge. I'm sorry, but I would say that. I know what code is, That's as far as I've gotten.
A smattering of knowledge of this.
Right. So I hope I understand the Torah that I'm teaching, and the metaphors maybe I should probably do better on. But what I would say is that so the Western civilization as a collective has a will, has a subconscious, has a guardian angel, let's say. It's actually, according to, I think, if I'm not mistaken, many of our commentators, Satan. Like the Satan is actually which is interesting, right? Because Christians are so anti the Satan, but he's actually their spiritual minister, right? He's like their guy. He's their guardian angel. So it's kind of funny with all the anti-Satan talk in churches, he's their guy. Why are you hating on your angel? But that's according to many opinions. It's the Satan. But essentially, that's who Yaakov fought, by the way. When Yaakov, in the beginning of Parshat Vayishlach, when Yaakov fights the angel, he's fighting the code of Edom. He's actually fighting the spiritual back end of Esav. And by the way, it's important to know that because he beat it, right, he basically defeated the spiritual back end of Esav, which means we've already won. It just takes a few thousand years to play out in this world. But we already beat them then. We beat them when Yaakov beat the angel, and when Yaakov beat the spiritual minister of that civilization. Meaning it's a done deal. It just has to play out here historically now. Right? So,
but I think in a way, continue a little bit with the topic you speak in last class. I think this couple that we have is more than an external. I think it's more internal between us. I think that's
also No, so also
I
that
think
gets
it's the
realigned.
main core because once we have inside of our own people these enemies that is going to sell us to the States or to Europe, and they're pro this other movement. So I think it's not new.
Within us. Well, within us, you have different tribes. You might have different reasons for thinking the way they do under certain situations. This is playing, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, I want to do 10 minutes on the Parsha because that's what
Okay.
I really came to teach about. But I think this other thing is important. But ultimately, just to answer your question, I think Esav, the kingdom of Edom, feels threatened by Israel coming back to life. I think that there have been different ways to deal with it. I think that, for example, in 1948, the church reconciled it, Western civilization reconciled it by basically saying two things. Number one, we gave them a state. We, the Western civilization, we, the international community, we gave Israel a state. We gave the Jews a state because we're good Christians, because we're good people, because we had mercy on them. We gave them a bomb shelter. And B, they're not even in their, Hebron. They're not even in Beit Lechem. They're not even in real Yerushalayim. They're not in Yericho. They're not in Beit El. They're not in Shechem. They're not in Shiloh. They're not in these places. They're in Netanya. They're in Hadera. They're in Tel Aviv. It doesn't matter. That was kind of the way Western civilization reconciled 1948. Because remember, for many centuries, the exile and vulnerability and victimization of the Jew was proof that Christianity is true. Right? If you go to the Christian version of Asia Torah Discovery, right? 300 years ago or 200 years ago, it's like, look at the Jew. Of course we're right. Right? Of course we have the truth. Look at the Jew. Want me to beat him? Want me to kick him? I kick the Jew right now. He can't do anything about it. See? Jesus. Right? That was their proof. And and this was a threat to that. The fact that the Jews came back to our land and established a state. So they reconciled it by saying, A, we gave it to them. We're in control, right? They didn't take it. We gave it to them, which also, of course, downplays our fight against the British, right? They had to kind of downplay that. Number one, they gave it to us. Number two, it's not really Eretz Yisrael. It's not the cradle of Jewish civilization. It's not the land of the Bible. It's like the coast, and some, Beersheba, fine. But it's not, it doesn't mean anything. That, by the way, was a major machloket between Israel and the United States, even at the beginning of the state, even between Ben-Gurion and many of the American presidents opposite him. Our terms last longer, especially Ben-Gurion and Netanyahu, whatever, tend to last longer than the presidential terms in the United States. But the way in 1967... What's better for the camera?
It's better for the camera.
For the camera is better. Okay.
All right. So, but in 1967, the world experienced a biblical style miracle according to the Jewish interpretation of Tanakh and according to the Jewish interpretation of Scripture. And the greatest victim of the 6-Day War was Christianity. Was actually their dogma. Okay. And as a result, I think there's been a pathological obsession by Western civilization as a self-preservation mechanism to force Israel to give up the lands we won in that war. Because if the West can force Israel to give up the lands we won in that war, it makes the event, this miraculous biblical style event in the middle of the 20th century, irrelevant, right? And so that's why I think it's been, I believe, on a deep level, why there's been such a deep pathological obsession amongst the Western governments, led by the United States, to force a two-state solution on us. Because it's a way for them to preserve their own, it's a way for them to prevent what we call Geula and what they call Armageddon. Okay? Right, keep in mind that when we talk about the Geula, the name for that in Western civilization is Armageddon.
Armageddon?
Well, Armageddon is what the Hebrew is coming from, but what Armageddon means in English in the collective consciousness of Western civilization is a negative, scary thing.
Why?
It's apocalyptic, right? Because it's the collapse of their civilization. And it is the collapse of their civilization. The question we have to ask ourselves is that a bad thing even for them?
Right.
Meaning, if you look at the way capitalism functions, if you look at the state of the American society today, I mean, maybe Israel's redemption and the collapse of Western civilization is a good thing even for people in the West,
Yeah.
right? But it might also be a painful thing. So we have to just, B'ezrat Hashem, when we become powerful enough, we could reassure them that they had nothing to fear. But in the meantime, they do fear, and they are powerful, and they try to suppress and obstruct our liberation. So we have to be aware of that as we move forward. So that's the deep answer to your question, but there are, of course, more geopolitical and realpolitik answers to your question that I don't want to get into now because I want at least 5 minutes of talking about the Parsha because that was the real reason why I asked this to be recorded. All right, so Parshat Bamidbar, right? This is the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, right? It's important for us to note that Sefer Bamidbar is not chronologically coming after Vayikra. Okay? Vayikra and Bamidbar are happening at the same time. They're both continuations of Sefer Shemot. Okay? We have the Torah, Sefer Bereshit, which is basically the creation of the world, the development of humanity, the development of Am Yisrael from Avraham, basically, to Yaakov and his sons, right? That's basically the story of a family which is going to eventually become Israel. Sefer Shemot continues that story. The beginning of Sefer Shemot continues that story, okay? The narrative of Israel now as a nation, in exile, in slavery, needing to be free, and then we are free. Then around the middle end of Sefer Shemot, beginning with Yitro, and basically Yitro and Mishpatim, Sefer Shemot changes. It's no longer a narrative. It's no longer the story of our development. It's now laws. And then after that, it shifts over, right? Basically the last 5 parshiot of, Ki Tisa is a little interesting because it also has a lot of narrative as well, but basically the last 5 parshiot of Sefer Shemot are essentially focused on the Mishkan, on Kedusha, on the work of the Kohanim, right? That is what is really focused on in the end of Shemot. Then it says at the end that when the cloud rested, we would stay still, and when the cloud lifted, we would move, okay? Vayikra is the story or the continuation of the end of Sefer Shemot, right? When the cloud would rest, and Moshe would continue to receive instructions on how to organize the Mishkan, the future Mikdash, what the Kohanim are meant to do, right? It's called Torah to Kohanim, right? The Torah of the Kohanim, right? That's Vayikra. Bamidbar is a continuation of the beginning of Shemot, the development of Israel, the story of Israel, right? And that's when the cloud would lift and we would move, okay? So it's interesting, by the way, when you look at the last pasuk, right? The last pasuk in the book of Vayikra, right? It says that we're Bahar Sinai, right? The last 2 words of the book of Vayikra, Bahar Sinai, we're in Mount Sinai, right? Now, if you look at the beginning, the first pasuk, right, of Sefer Bamidbar, we are Bamidbar Sinai, right? We're in the wilderness of Sinai, not Har Sinai. Our perspective is different. The perspective of the books are different, right? The theme of this prophecy is different, okay? We're now in the wilderness. We're now traveling. We're developing. It's back to the story, okay? And Bamidbar, the book of Bamidbar is going to really show us the development of Israel through 40 years of wandering in the or almost 40 years of wandering in the desert. It's basically divided up into what you have is first the Parshat Bamidbar, where it talks about the national formation, right, where each tribe should be located in proximity to the Mishkan, which is the core of who we are, which is Kedusha, right? Then you have Naso, which is going to deal with a lot of personal crises that different Israelites might have. Then Baalotcha are crises in terms of our connection to the Torah, our understanding of the Torah. Korach is crises in leadership, in how we formulate our leadership. Shlach Lecha, crises regarding Eretz Yisrael, the conquest or not conquest of the land of Israel. Then Chukat is our military conflicts with the other nations. Balak is our spiritual conflicts with the other nations, right? Then you have Pinchas, which is going to have another census, just like Bamidbar is going to have a census. Pinchas has a census. These two censuses are like bookends of Sefer Bamidbar. And then Matot and Maseh essentially wrap up what we've gone through, like summarize what we've gone through and kind of frame it. So Bamidbar is all about the national formation. It's really one of the names, by the way, of Sefer Bamidbar used to be Chumash HaPikudim, which is translated into English as the Book of Numbers, right? The Book of Numbers comes from an ancient, just like Leviticus is maybe a bad translation of Torah Kohanim, right? The Book of Exodus is a translation of Sefer Yetziat Mitzrayim. We always had these two names for each of these books. We kept, Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Devarim, but the translations that we're used to hearing of these 5 books are actually translations, or maybe in some cases poor translations, of the alternative names of these books. Okay? So, Bamidbar basically is focused on the census and the organization of the nation of Israel, okay? How we're properly organized, okay? And you see, by the way, in the census that occurs, you see a combination of numbers and personal names, okay? That's important because personal names express individuality and the numbers express collective identity, right? There are societies in the world that are very collectivist, and there are societies in the world that are very individualistic. They put the individual at the center. Israel is both. Israel understands the importance of us each feeling like we have unique, independent, individual identity, and that we're part of something greater than ourselves, that we're part of a bigger collective that has an important function in history, right? So this expresses both in that sense. What's very interesting, by the way, about, first of all, we should talk about how the language changes in the census, meaning when the idea of the census is introduced, essentially we get the sons of Leah, then the sons of Rachel, then the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. That's a little weird for me, by the way. Right away we see it goes Dan, and then Asher, and then Gad, and then Naphtali, which doesn't make sense to me. I'm actually hoping to find an answer to this question, because Dan and Naphtali are the sons of Bilhah. Gad and Asher, in that order, are the sons of Zilpah. So the question is, why does the text first start with Dan, then go to Asher, the younger son of Zilpah, then Gad, the older son of Zilpah, and then Naphtali, the younger son of Bilhah? That doesn't necessarily make sense to me. But otherwise, with the exception of Levi not being there, obviously Levi is not there because Levi has been taken out of this. We're doing in order the sons of Leah, then the sons of Rachel. Of course, Ephraim comes before Menashe because of that was switched already, and then you have the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah in a strange order. Next time, when the census actually takes place, the order changes. We still have Reuven and then Shimon, just like before, but then before Yehuda, we have the tribe of Gad. Okay, Gad, by the way, is an important tribe. It was our greatest warriors came from Gad. Our greatest military leaders often came from Gad. They had a unique fighting style where they could take off the head and right arm of an opponent in battle. Keep in mind that most of our fighters at the time used to fight with sickle swords, with the exception of some notable leaders like David HaMelech, who would wield the sword of Goliath, and Yehuda Maccabee, who would wield the sword of Apollonius, both to commemorate their victories over these enemies. Most of the Israelite warriors would use sickle swords. And it's possible, by the way, one of my sons had an interesting suggestion that Yehuda Maccabee actually knew the fighting style of the tribe of Gad, right? Because when he killed the general Nicanor, he took off. We know he took off his head and right arm. My son assumes that he took off the head and right arm together in one strike, which would have been using the fighting style of the tribe of Gad. By the way, just because they're great warriors doesn't mean they have the bigger picture. That was the weakness of God. They knew when it's a good time to advance, when it's a good time to retreat, according to very narrow military considerations, but they didn't necessarily always take into consideration how this would affect the nation, our morale, our mission more broadly, right? So the tribe of God can't necessarily be given full responsibility to make these decisions, right? But they're great fighters. So God is now wedged between Shimon and Yehuda, right? So what we see now is that the tribal order has changed according to the encampments. Okay, we're going to have in the south around the Mishkan. Basically, the Mishkan is at the center. The Mishkan is kedusha. The Mishkan is like our purpose, let's say, and around the Mishkan are the 4 tribes of Levi. To the south is Kahat, to the west is Gershon, to the north is Merari, and to the east is the Kohanim, including Moshe. We're including Moshe in the category of the Kohanim. When we divide the tribe of Levi into 4 tribes, just like we divide Yosef into Ephraim and Manasseh, Moshe is not counted amongst Kahat. He's counted amongst the Kohanim, okay, with Aaron and his sons. Okay, so in the south now, together with Kahat, will be Reuven, Shimon, and Gad. To the east, together with the Kohanim, is Yehuda, Yisachar, and Zvulun. To the west, together with Gershon, are Ephraim, Manasseh, and Binyamin. And to the north, together with Merari, are going to be Dan, Naphtali, and Asher. Okay? This is important. This is the national structure of Israel. Okay? This is where all the tribes find their proper place, so to speak. Right? And this will influence the trajectory of Israel. Okay? But then, again, when this is later spoken about the encampments in the next chapter, the orders changed again. Now we start with the tribes in the east, Yehuda, Yisachar, and Zvulun, and then we go to the south, to Reuven, Shimon, and Gad. Meaning that there's constant development in the formation of the nation, in the internal structure of the nation, who's going to take a leadership role. And then we're told about the Levi'im replacing the firstborn. Okay? Remember, in ancient Egypt, like most ancient societies, the spiritual leaders were the firstborn of each family. They were the spiritual leaders. That's one of the reasons why the 10th plague, the plague of the firstborn, was such a catastrophic plague for Egyptians. Because we weren't just killing a member of each household, or Hashem wasn't just killing a member of each household, he was killing the spiritual leadership of Egypt. Right? And that spiritual leadership was replaced by the Israelite firstborn. So also, by the way, Israel as a nation replaces Egypt in that plague as the firstborn of humanity, as the main character of history. That's important because each of those 4 empires who are derivatives of Egypt, who are Toldot of Egypt, will later try to replace Israel as the main character of history. Okay, so Israel replaces Egypt. The firstborn of Israel replaced the firstborn of Egypt as a spiritual leadership. Okay, so we're doing something very interesting here. We're now doing the same thing that the Egyptians did, but a Jewish way. But now we develop further to the point, after Har Sinai, we're developing further to the point where we're totally changing the structure to having a tribe that's holy. The spiritual leadership is now going to be the tribe of Levi. Okay? Now this was always meant to happen, but sometimes what Hashem does is he makes a historical event take place that gives us a good reason to accept why it happened. In this case, it's the golden calf. Right? The tribe of Levi behaves heroically for Hashem's honor at the incident of the golden calf. The firstborn are assumed to have played a negative role here as the spiritual leadership of the nation down below and being the ones responsible to communicate with the higher power, right? They seem to be somewhat responsible. So it makes sense to everybody now that Levi is replacing the firstborn. But this should be understood in the same way we understand Zionism, right? Zionism was the Jews doing European nationalism, but a Jewish way, right? We kind of copied them. Even though European nationalism is actually a copy of ancient Israelite nationalism, we did a copy of the copy, right? We did the copy of the copy, which is basically us creating Zionism, us creating a uniquely Jewish version of the type of nationalism that existed in European society. And now, as we continue to develop, maybe we're going to replace that with the original thing that they were copying to begin with. Right now, within Israeli society, we might be replacing that Jewish flavor of European nationalism with something more deeply rooted in our identity and our history and our destiny.
Is this your flavor of Zionism?
I'm sorry?
Is this your kind of Zionism, the one that's like original from
Is it
Israel?
mine?
Yeah.
I would identify as a post-Zionist, saying that we're done with Zionism. Zionism took us as far as it would take us, or Zionism we could understand is the movement of Mashiach ben Yosef. And now that it's been successful, I think Zionism brought us as far as the Six-Day War. And I think one of the things we need to understand about the Six-Day War and Yom Yerushalayim is it marks the end of the Zionist era and the beginning of something new that we have to actually figure out.
Yeah.
And figure out what comes after Zionism, what comes after Mashiach ben Yosef.
Which is the quintessential one of ours, yeah?
Which is what we have to figure out.
Yeah.
Which is I think the type of national consciousness that our ancestors had before the Romans destroyed us, and that now we should be coming back to, now that we're back in our land, and now that we're developing as a nation in our land and our society is developing, etc. Tov, Chag Sameach.